She gave him everything: her savings, her trust, her seat at his feet every Sunday morning while he preached about prosperity and God's mission to multiply the faithful. She was a grandmother, a nurse who had worked double shifts for 30 years, a woman who immigrated to America with nothing and built a life through sacrifice. And when the man she called pastor told her that God wanted to bless her financially, she believed him. We all know that scammers target the faithful. They slip into churches wearing nice suits and quoting scripture, promising divine returns on earthly investments. But they usually don't stand at the pulpit. They usually don't lead the congregation in prayer before asking for your life savings. They usually don't look you in the eye and call it God's work. This is the story of how a trio of men posing as pastors infiltrated black immigrant churches across Maryland and beyond, preaching a gospel of guaranteed wealth while secretly operating a $28 million Ponzi scheme. They called their company First $1 Million. They promised monthly returns as high as 35%, risk-free. They recruited nurses, accountants, and engineers. They targeted grandmothers and grandfathers who had worked their entire lives for financial security. And when the scheme collapsed in 2019, more than 1,200 people lost everything. This is a story about faith weaponized, about trust betrayed, about communities devastated by men who claimed to speak for God while emptying their bank accounts. And it is a story about how justice eventually came knocking. Dennis Mbongeni Jali was not your average conman. He was a prophet. At least, that is what he called himself. The South African Forex trader arrived in America with a story so polished it practically gleamed. He was a self-made millionaire, a man who had risen from nothing to build an empire through discipline, faith, and an uncanny ability to multiply money in the foreign exchange markets. "I own 28 cars that I bought, all cash," Jali boasted in a 2019 interview. "And I'm not talking cheap cars. I've never owned a Toyota in my life." He even wrote a book about his success. The title, My First $1 Million, 8 Digits Achieved Through 8 Principles of Highly Successful Jet-Setting Millionaires. The description promised to reveal how a young boy from South Africa rose from dust to power. It was an inspiring story. It was also, according to federal prosecutors, a complete fabrication. But Jali did not work alone. He needed legitimacy. He needed American faces. He found them in Arlie Ray Johnson, a 61-year-old minister from Bowie, Maryland, and John Erasmus Frimpong, a 40-year-old Ghanaian national who sometimes preached at a church in the same area. Johnson became Chief Operating Officer. Frimpong became Chief Marketing Officer. Together, the three men built something that looked like a wealth management company, but functioned like a trap. They called it First $1 Million. Headquartered in Largo, Maryland, the company offered 12-month investment contracts with a seductive name, Corporate Guarantees. Investors were promised monthly returns between 6 and 35%. Risk-free, principal protected in a trust account, returns regardless of market volatility. The targets were specific: African immigrant communities across Maryland, Texas, Georgia, Florida, and New York. Nurses, accountants, engineers, churchgoers. The men hosted lavish recruitment events at upscale hotels and banquet halls. They appeared at church functions, preaching about God's mission and financial freedom. Jali would hand cash to certain parishioners during services, proof of his supposed trading genius. It looked like salvation. It felt like blessing. Therefore, people believed. Here is how a Ponzi scheme works. Investors hand over their money expecting it to be invested. But instead of investing, the operator uses funds from new investors to pay fake returns to earlier investors. Everyone believes they are getting rich. Everyone believes the system works. Therefore, everyone recruits their friends and family. The scheme grows until there are not enough new investors to pay the old ones. Then it collapses. Everyone loses. This is exactly what First $1 Million was doing. Investors wired money, wrote checks, handed over cash. They believed their funds were being invested in foreign exchange and cryptocurrency markets. They received access to online dashboards showing their account balances growing. Monthly returns arrived like clockwork, but none of it was real. No trades were ever made. No investments existed. The dashboards were fabrications. The returns were other people's money. Where did the actual funds go? Federal prosecutors would later trace the spending. Jali dropped $78,000 on private jet travel for personal trips. He purchased a $27,000 Audi, a $20,000 Porsche. The men transferred investor money to themselves and family members in cash and cryptocurrency. They used stolen funds to host more lavish recruitment events at expensive hotels, which brought in more victims, which funded more theft. The cycle fed itself. By 2019, more than 1,200 people had invested. Total funds exceeded $28 million. Victims ranged from young professionals to elderly grandparents handing over retirement savings. Frimpong ran a side operation, contracting directly with individual victims and stealing an additional $797,000 for himself. But the machine was breaking down. By spring of 2019, First Million's bank accounts were constantly overdrawn. Checks sent to investors for their monthly returns started bouncing, returned for insufficient funds. Johnson and Frimpong knew the company was collapsing. Therefore, they did what desperate con men do. They kept recruiting. They kept lying. They never told a single investor that the money was gone. The religious framing made everything worse. Victims who asked too many questions were made to feel faithless. Doubting the investment meant doubting God's plan. Many victims had recruited their own family members into the scheme. Parents brought in children. Grandmothers brought in granddaughters. The trust networks that held communities together became the very weapons used to destroy them. In May 2019, the checks stopped clearing. Investors who had grown accustomed to monthly returns suddenly found themselves staring at bounced payments. Dashboards that once displayed growing balances now showed errors or stopped updating entirely. Phone calls to the First Million offices went unanswered. The men who had preached so confidently about God's financial blessings had gone silent. Hundreds of people realized the truth at the same time. The money was gone. Dennis Jali knew what was coming before anyone else. When he learned that the FBI had opened an investigation, he did not stay to face his congregation. He did not answer questions. He boarded a flight to his native South Africa and disappeared. 1,200 victims were left behind. His co-conspirators were left behind. The man who had built the entire scheme simply walked away. The human devastation was staggering. Nurses who had worked double shifts for 30 years lost their entire retirement savings. Grandparents who had invested everything they had, hoping to leave something behind for their grandchildren, were left with nothing. Some victims had put in tens of thousands of dollars. Others had invested over $100,000. People lost homes. People delayed retirement indefinitely. People fell into debt they would spend years climbing out of. But the financial losses were only part of the damage. These victims had trusted the men because of their faith. They had believed because a pastor told them to believe. Therefore, when the scheme collapsed, it was not just their bank accounts that shattered. It was their relationship with faith itself. Many felt profound shame. They blamed themselves for being foolish, even though they had been targeted by sophisticated manipulators who knew exactly how to exploit trust. Some could not bring themselves to report the crime. Accusing a man of God felt like a sin of its own. The FBI moved forward anyway. On July 27, 2020, a federal grand jury returned a 13-count indictment against Jali, Johnson, and Frimpong. The charges included conspiracy, wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. The SEC and CFTC filed parallel civil actions. The FBI created a public questionnaire seeking additional victims who had not yet come forward. Jali was arrested in South Africa later that year, but extradition moves slowly. Therefore, the architect of the scheme remained beyond American justice, while his victims filed for bankruptcy, left their churches, and struggled to rebuild lives that should never have been broken. In September 2022, Ali Ray Johnson finally faced a jury. The trial lasted 10 days. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece: the fake investment contracts, the non-existent trust accounts, the bounced checks, the private jets and luxury cars purchased with stolen money. Johnson had presented himself as a minister. He had stood in churches and spoken of God's mission. Therefore, the betrayal cut deeper than ordinary fraud. The jury convicted him: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, FBI Special Agent in Charge, Jennifer Boone, did not mince words. They used the victims' hard-earned money for luxury cars, private jets, and family vacations, she said, while the victims ended up with false promises and empty hopes. John Erasmus Frimpong did not go to trial. He pleaded guilty and admitted everything. No trading had ever occurred. No trust accounts existed. He had lied to more than 1,200 people and stolen nearly $800,000 in a separate scheme of his own. Sentencing came in early 2023. Johnson received 78 months in federal prison, 6.5 years. Frimpong received 114 months, more than 9 years. Both men were ordered to pay restitution totaling $16,664,020. But here is the thing about restitution. Ordering payment and actually recovering money are two very different things. Much of what was stolen had already been spent, consumed, gone. Victims may never see a dollar returned. And Dennis Jali, the mastermind who invented the lies and built the company on nothing but theft. He remains in South Africa, arrested in 2020, still awaiting extradition as of the latest reports, still beyond the reach of American courts while his victims struggle to rebuild. The SEC and FBI have since increased outreach to immigrant and church communities. The warning signs are always the same: guaranteed returns, risk-free investments, pressure to act quickly, divine endorsement. If a pastor promises you 35% monthly returns, he is not speaking for God. He is speaking for himself. The men who called themselves pastors stood in front of congregations and promised miracles. They quoted scripture. They spoke of God's mission. They asked their brothers and sisters in faith to trust them with everything. And more than 1,200 people did. Arlie Ray Johnson will spend the next 6.5 years in prison. John Erasmus Frimpong will serve more than 9. Together, they have been ordered to repay nearly $17 million to the people they betrayed. But money taken from a grandmother's retirement account cannot simply be returned. Trust shattered by a man you called pastor cannot be rebuilt with a court order. And Dennis Jolly, the mastermind who fled to South Africa when the scheme collapsed, remains beyond American justice for now. He is the one who invented the lies. He is the one who built the company on nothing but theft. And he is still waiting for extradition, while his victims wait for something that might feel like closure. The grandmother who gave him everything. She was one of 1,200. There were nurses, teachers, engineers, people who came to this country with nothing and built lives through work and sacrifice. They believed because they had faith, and faith in the hands of a predator became a weapon. If you know someone who has been targeted by Affinity Fraud, report it, talk about it, protect your community the way these men failed to. And if this story stays with you, if you want to understand how predators operate and how communities fight back, subscribe, because these stories matter and they are far from over.